Yeah, welcome everybody to our first 1000 XP guest lecture in Munich, and of course a long-standing series at Macromedia in Leipzig. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today Victor Navarro from the Techno Campus in Mataró, which is next to Barcelona. So very nice, very nice to have you, Victor. Victor is one of the leading game study scholars, if I might say so, in Spain, and he's also one of the foundational members of DIGRA Spain. DIGRA is one of the biggest digital games research associations, which are having conferences and get-togethers from the games community all around Europe and the world. And Victor was one of the founding members to promote this in Spain, so very nicely done. He has also a master in communication and a PhD in game studies, where he wrote a book about Libertad Dirigida. It's about enclosure of agency, so player agency, but in a sense that players don't have agency in games. Victor also did some research stays throughout Europe, and one of which was in Copenhagen at the ITU in 2016, where we also met, became colleagues, and I might also say we became friends since then. And yeah, so without further ado, let's hear about Japanese game culture from a real expert in this sense, Victor Navarro. Now feel free to share your screen and go ahead. Good luck.
Thanks a lot, Gerald. I'm going to share the slides for today, and I want to start thanking you for having me, even if it's remotely. You cannot be here. And thanks, Tom, for helping with the technical side, and Henrik for taking me on a tour to meet your lovely students before I started presenting this. Okay, I'm going to start my stopwatch for an hour. I have material here for longer and for shorter. We can squeeze things a bit more. We can extend whatever you like. But I want to spend 1 hour discussing this, and then we can have some time for questions and answers. So I'll try to make it just 1 hour, and whatever is left outside of my presentation, whatever you feel like it was missing or questions you have, you can ask them later, and hopefully we'll have a very productive and long discussion. Gerald here asked me to come and talk about Japanese video games to you, which is a huge responsibility because, as you can tell, I'm not Japanese, and I'm very cautious with discussing cultural productions that are not from my environment without a very insider knowledge, so to speak. So I'm not saying that we cannot discuss Japanese games as Japanese, we cannot discuss Japanese culture. I'm not saying that we are not allowed to, I'm not going to enter in the muddy terrains of cultural appropriation and these kind of things. But I'm saying that when one discusses something that's made millions of kilometers from one's place, one has to take into account that there's going to be a lot of things of their daily lives that produce this culture that are hard to get, hard to know, hard to study. So it's true that I've been studying Japanese video games for a long time now. I started researching some very small things in very small Japanese games, and then slowly I moved into more general discussions of what does it mean to be, for a game to be Japanese, what makes Japanese games Japanese, so to speak. But I'm always keeping this perspective of a European researcher. I'm European, same as you. We do this from Europe. It's not a matter of identities. It's not a matter of national pride or whatever. It's a matter of perspective. We are very far from Japan. I would love to be closer to Japan. I would love to have a teleportation device that could take me to Japan at any time, but it's a long flight to Japan. So we are going to discuss this from the perspective of some European players, gamers, researchers, aspiring game makers that want to discuss Japanese video games. And today I'm going to introduce two main concepts: Gêmu, the word Gêmu, the idea of Gêmu, and the idea of Japaneseness. That's basically all. I want to describe these concepts, and I want to discuss them a bit with you, and then I will have some kind of extras at the end of the presentation, some bonus content. But basically, if I succeed in explaining Gêmu and Japaneseness to you, and how to use it in a practical manner, this will be a successful talk. I have been told that you are an applied University of Applied Sciences. I know that you are learning to be game makers. I'm a theory guy. I'm a theorist. I'm not a developer. I come from research. I come from game studies. So I'm going to try to bring it up one step closer to game design. But I'm not going to give you any kind of actual advice on how to make games. Okay, I'm not a game maker. I'm not. I'm going to close this because otherwise you're going to see my WhatsApp messages there. I'm not going to tell you how to make games. I'm going to try to tell you how to apply the theory that I use regularly to a more applied perspective, to a more practical perspective. What can you learn as game makers, as practical practitioners, from a guy who is very much into theory? And again, we are going to discuss Gêmu and Japaneseness, two main concepts that may seem very hard, very easy to understand, but they actually prove to be very hard to unpack, very hard to study. And before getting into the gist of it, I want to ask how many of you would say that you like Japanese video games in general? Okay, so it's a nice percentage. How many of you like Japanese games because they are Japanese? How many of you say, yeah, I'm going to read about Japanese game makers, I'm going to look for who's making games in Japan? Okay, so that's very, very telling, because it shows that Japanese video games are a huge part of the medium, are a huge part of video games, but most of the times we don't even realize that they come from Japan. Japanese games kind of gave shape to the medium in the 80s, and from then on, they have had a few ups and downs, but they are normally associated with video games in general. This might be one of the reasons that makes us think of Japanese video games as just video games. The point when we use the word Gêmu, Gêmu means games in Japanese, it's an English game in Japanese phonetics, is that we are highlighting that they are made in Japan. The same way we separate animation from anime and manga from comic from manga, my proposal is that we should do the same with video games and Gêmu. We should study Gêmu as games made in Japan. We should separate games made in Japan as a distinct category for analysis, okay? And this is going to seem contradictory with the view on Japaneseness I'm going to give you. I'm going to tell you how to look for these traits of Japaneseness, and you will probably say, yeah, Victor, I insist. I love Japanese video games. I love many Japanese video games, but I don't look for Japaneseness in them. And that's okay. Okay, they are two separate ideas, and together they will help us see the importance of Japanese games in the medium without necessarily being only for people that love Japan, okay? Another question before we begin, do you read manga? Do you watch anime? Who reads manga? Okay, who watches anime, TV, movies? Okay, super. So you are aware of your media consumption of Japanese content when it comes to animation and manga. You know that you play a lot of Japanese video games, but when I say, and do you play them because they come from Japan? That's an unexpected question. Today we're going to think about that question, and we are going to think as developers. So hence this title, Gêmu Play, playing and analyzing Japanese games from Europe. I hope you can all see this well at home, the 24 people that are connected. And again, this approach from Europe and discussing Gêmu and Japaneseness is a proposal that I make to you in order to move beyond the cliches. We're going to think about Japan, trying to avoid the typical things that we think when we say Japan. And most of you will have different stereotypes about Japan, like Japan is very weird, or Japan is very funny, or they do very exaggerated, very loud animation, or whatever. But some of these stereotypes are going to coincide, and you are going to share a set of ideas about what does it mean to be Japanese, and we are going to analyze these pre-existing ideas. We're going to analyze and problematize Japaneseness in a national and international environment. Okay, we are European players that play Japanese games. This is actually very good. I'm very happy with video games being such an international medium, and maybe some of you want to work in the future for a Japanese company. That's a completely different topic, but it's a sign that Japanese are seeing as an international medium. I see some Zelda t-shirts here. I brought mine, but I forgot it because it was cold. But we all think we can all agree that Zelda is very important, and we don't see the, Zelda and think, okay, I like Zelda because it's Japanese. It's kind of a general universal heritage for us players, for us video game players. And at the end, I'm going to give you some practical takeaways from this perspective to apply to your own practice. So moving on with this, again, there's going to be a lot of screenshots and a lot of theory, and it might sound complicated, but basically, these are the two main ideas, Gêmu and Japaneseness, okay? And before getting into that, I want to direct you to this very short and clear piece by Christopher Smith, published last year, How to Avoid Bad Takes on Japan. Professor Smith here says that when we discuss Japan, we tend to romanticize Japanese culture. We tend to over-explain everything because of the ideas we have about Japanese culture. And we tend to say, for example, yeah, Final Fantasy is like this because it's Japanese, and in Japan they have Shinto, and they have geisha, and they have samurai. We don't think Final Fantasy is like this because it takes after role-playing games from the West, and it takes after, I don't know, cyberpunk and epic fantasy or whatever. We tend to idealize the traits of Japanese culture that we know. This is very common, and Professor Smith here says we should avoid essences. The same way it wouldn't be polite to come here and say, you are German, you are all German. My experience with German people, I have lived in Mallorca, so you can imagine the kind of experience I have with German people. If I were to say, this is what I know about being German from my experience, and I assume that you are all this way, it will be like you saying, okay, you're a Spaniard, so you are a bullfighter, and you like flamenco, and you like paella. And I would say, yeah, but I'm an animalist, vegetarian, and I hate bullfighting, and I'm very strongly against bullfighting. So we allow cultures that we know to be diverse, to have conflict. But with Japan, we say, yeah, Japan, samurai, geisha, flowers, sakura flowers, and so on and so forth. We kind of throw an essence to Japan and say, this is the true essence of Japan. What Professor Smith here says is that we should try to explain things from history. We should acknowledge that cultures are complicated, that within one single culture you have many points of view, many experiences, and being Japanese is just being from one place. You are from Japan, you have a set of experiences, you might share, for example, your love for trains, but you don't share your political views with another Japanese. And when you try to explain why video games from Japan are the way they are, it's better to talk about history and not about essence, okay? The same way we will say, we in Germany do things like this because historically we have this tradition, okay? Tradition comes from history. So this is a very good warning. This idea that we should have only good takes about Japan, about Japanese culture, through the same things we will use to explain any other culture, politics, economics, social forces, elections, protests, counter-protests, rhetoric, whatever. And with this in mind, I show you this. Okay, this is the kind of content when you discuss a game made in Japan, you can say, okay, Elden Ring, yeah, it's very good, it's very bad, whatever. You discuss Elden Ring, but when you say Japanese video games, in the Western press, you normally still today see stuff like that. This was 6 years ago, but this is something we can still find today. And I love quirky, weird video games, but this is something that's very limiting. To say that video games from Japan, oh, okay, yeah, they are Japanese, so they are going to be like this, like Takeshi's Castle, like very weird, like very hard to understand. This idea of wacky Japan has been called a new phase of Orientalism. I'm not going to get into discussions about Orientalism, but basically Orientalism is the idea that you either simplify, romanticize, or dehumanize someone because they come from the East, whatever that means, okay, the East or the West. So that's something that we should avoid, especially if you want to create games that are going to be played all over the world. I think most of you will agree that you want to sell your games in Europe, America, North America, Latin America, South America, East Asia, whatever. You want to sell them all over the world, and you want to move beyond these stereotypes. And here I bring you a very short test. I'm going to show you two screens, this and this. Oh, you can see the answer there, so that's very bad. But can you tell me which one of these is the Japanese game and which one is the Western game? And you have seen the answer, but Nippon Marathon, a very quick game, was made in the UK, and Resident Evil 6 was made in Japan, even if it takes in the White House. It's a very American inspired game, inspired by American popular culture, and it uses American voice actors and so on and so forth. So we are going to defend, as I did in a very humble, very short, very small paper a few years ago with my dear esteemed colleague Antonio Loriguillo, that it is useful to think of Japanese games as Gêmu, as something distinct, but not because they are all the same, okay? Japanese video games are Japanese, but this does not mean that they all look alike and they all do the same. They are as diverse as any other collection of video games made in other parts of the world, but they share the same place of production, okay? So when we say Gêmu, we follow scholars like Martin Picard, who used the word Gêmu to discuss the history of Japanese video games. We talk about Gêmu as a site of production. The same way I just published a book I edited with a colleague called Perspectives on the European Video Game. I defend that we should think about the European video game not as a style, not as an identity, but as a reality of production, okay? If video games are made in Europe, they are made under European conditions, not the conditions that you have in Japan, not the conditions that you might have in North America. And in this paper, we identified that Japanese video games, or Gêmu, were connected to anime, to manga, to cosplay, to merchandising, to many other things, through traits of production and of style. One of the things that we can learn from Japanese video games is that they are very well connected to local cultural agents. For instance, if they need animation, they can hire a studio like Studio 4C, 4° C, or Toei, or any other, to create the cutscenes, the cinematic scenes, to give their games a sort of anime quality. They have very good anime studios, and they use these studios to make the cutscenes. So that's something that we see when we realize, as Picard suggested, that Japanese video games are made in Japan. This is very evident, and maybe you can think now, Victor, did you really come all the way from Barcelona to tell me that Japanese video games are made in Japan? Yeah, but that's only the beginning, okay? That's the main idea to discuss the Japaneseness of Japanese video games, okay? They are made in Japan, so they are going to be in contact with the realities of Japan, and they are going to share the same history. Again, the advice of Christopher Smith, always historicize, always look at things from the point of view of history. And the point of view of history shows us that Japanese video games were not created from Japanese traditions. They didn't follow after no theater, after kabuki, after even the origins of manga. They were created in imitation of the American industry. Picard says that the first phase of Japanese video games was imitation. We don't have time to go fully, but the first step was imitation, and Space Invaders, they started innovating, but they started before that by imitating American video games. As Aoyama and Isuzi say here, Japan, the industry, Japan's video game industry, emerged out of corporate sponsorships in arcades, toys, and consumer electronic industries, and drew skills from the comic book and animated film sectors. Okay, so it came from industries that were part of Japan, especially toy makers. The connection to toys is huge in Japan, and that's something we forget a lot here. We try to make video games very serious, very deep, and we should not forget that video games come from the family of toys. This doesn't mean that they have to be weird and funny and comedic, but they are part of the family of toys. And Aoyama and Isuzi tells us that they come from this industry, and this industry started creating, as Picard says, clones, basically clones of other video games. As an example here, let me go back, jump a couple of slides. Elepong by Taito and Pongtron by Sega were made shortly after Pong came out in the market. So Pong was a huge phenomenon all over the world, and Japanese companies copied, cloned Pong in Japan to give Japanese people their own versions of Pong, to give them what they wanted from what they had seen about Pong. Another very important Japanese cultural critic, Hiroki Azuma, says that many of the contents that we consume, that are created in Japanese popular culture, come from imitation and regurgitation and transformation of American material. He says that they are pseudo-Japan manufactured from US produced material. Okay, this maybe can be seen as bad or good. I don't have a clear opinion, but we have to acknowledge that popular culture is very transnational. Okay, they had this history of American popular culture in Japan, and they took it and they transformed it into something that was very, very Japanese. So the word here will be Japanization, or to Japanize. They take something from another culture and they Japanize it and they transform it for the Japanese audiences. So this is the origins of Gêmu, and in the recent years we have seen that video games from Japan have had a very weird arc, so to speak. Like 10 years ago, maybe a bit earlier, 13 years ago, American creators came back to the scene and started dominating the scene, and we had people from Japan and people from America criticizing the poor state of Japanese game makers and of Japanese games. Like Japan is done, Japan used to be #1, and now they are selling very little, and they are not innovating, and they are not leading, and people said that Japan as a creative industry was dead, that Japanese video games were dead. They had been dominating for a couple of decades, and then they stopped being important, or maybe 3 decades even. But then around the time of, see here, you can see in 2012, Japan's decline. The Japanese video game industry is dead, it has ceased to be, it is no more, and so on and so forth. Japan used to rule video games, so what happened? Well, many things happen, but all of a sudden we have this, the grand return of the great Japanese video game, with Miyazaki, with Zelda Breath of the Wild, with many other games. We suddenly speak of a great Japanese resurgence in the medium of video games. Here we can see something quite funny. When Japanese video games or Gêmu dominated the earth in the beginning, from around 83, 85 to 2009, people thought the same as you. I like video games. Oh, turns out most of them are made in Japan. Then when Japan fell, so to speak, inverted commas, they said, oh, so all of a sudden Japan is no more. And now I realize that Japan used to be big, but they are not anymore. And when Japan comes back, we speak of the great Japanese video game. I have noticed that in this resurgence, in this revival, people are starting to think of Japanese video games as Japanese, something that didn't happen before. There's a lot of conversation around what makes Japan a powerhouse, what makes them so creative, and so on and so forth. And this didn't happen when we just took Japan as granted, when we just said, yeah, Japan is big, and that's all. This is good for us because it means that we are looking into the practice of game making in Japan, not only accepting that Japanese video games are number one and that's all, and that you cannot make a good video game from Germany, and that you should all just give up and say, no, video games are a thing for the Japanese. I would say that the idea now is that you can learn from Japan, you can collaborate even with Japanese game makers, and you can think that they are doing something good. They are doing something very creative and very expressive. So this makes us think, as Picard says, that Gêmu are local productions. We have always seen them as international, but Japanese video games are made first for Japanese people and then later for international audiences. There are a couple of books here that I would recommend in case you are interested in exploring this. But for example, Mia Consalvo has interviewed American players who are very addicted to Japanese video games and who value these video games because they are Japanese. And the interviews are very good and the conclusions are very well explained. Consalvo speaks of hybrid players and hybrid cultures. Video games made in Japan, but played in America from an American perspective. And at the same time, Rachel Hutchinson has analyzed Japanese video games as part of Japanese culture. So we can see here international sides or aspects of Japanese video games and very national aspects of Japanese video games. They are not contradictory, they are not opposed. You can understand these products from both points of view. And if you are interested in Japanese culture in general, Japanese pop culture in general, and how it became so big, you can read this book by Matt Alt, a translator from Japanese to American, to English, sorry, an American translator, who has published this book about the rise of Japanese technology and the Walkman and the karaoke machines, the idea of karaoke, cosplay, and many other keystones of popular culture that have become very international, but were created in Japan, okay? So this is Gêmu. The first half of the talk is dedicated to the idea that Gêmu are Gêmu, they are made in Japan, but they are not forced to be highly Japanese, so to speak. And here we can reflect on how can you explore your own culture, your own situation through the medium of video games. I'm going to give you this idea of Japaneseness, okay? And I'm going to remind you that Japaneseness or Germanness or Europeanness or Spanishness or whatever should not be an essence. There are no essences to cultures, but conversations and collections of cultural markers, okay? For example, can you give me one cultural marker of Spain that you know? When you think of Spain, give me items. You can say bullfighting. I'm not going to get angry. Tapas, yeah. That's fantastic. Almost every country in the world has a tapas bar, whatever that means. But when you are not in Spain, you find tapas bar everywhere. In Spain, you don't have tapas bar because tapas are supposed to be part of a regular bar. That's very good. Imagine a producer, a publisher that comes here and says, I'm going to make a game for German people based in Spain. The game is going to take place in Spain, and we want it to be very Spanish because we have an audience that enjoys Spanishness. You can do your research, and you can go there, and you can take pictures, and you can talk to locals, or you can say tapas, Almodóvar, flamenco, maybe Rosalia now, who's from near my hometown. But yeah, these are the ideas of cultural markers, okay? When you explore a culture, you can see these signposts that guide you through the culture, okay? So Japaneseness will be the collection of ideas, and this is a very short and simplistic explanation, so you're going to excuse me, but I have to give it very condensed. When we talk of Japaneseness, we don't talk about an essence of what Japan is, but of a collection of assumptions, of ideas that we and others, and the Japanese themselves, think about Japan, okay? And again, no culture is an island. Culture in general is made and developed through exchanges, introductions, points of contact, and perspectives. So Japanese culture has a lot in common with American popular culture, with Korean culture, with Chinese culture, with German culture. They love German philosophy there, and when they discover, so to speak, philosophy in the turn of the 20th century, they read a lot of German philosophers like Husserl later, or others before that, and they got very good at discussing philosophy with the German, which is very, very difficult. I've tried to read Hegel a lot of times, and it's like climbing a mountain, even if you read a simplified version. So Japaneseness is the collection of ideas that we have in mind when we talk about Japanese culture. Can you give me like a couple of Japaneseness markers? I'm going to start the list by saying sushi.
Sakura flowers.
Sakura flowers. Do you play Yakuza, the Yakuza games? Who plays the Yakuza games here? Okay, so what kind of things do you see all the time in Yakuza? Don Quixote, for example?
I don't know the word. Drinks, vending machines.
Yeah, vending machines, for example. Yeah, that's an icon of Japaneseness that you see a lot of times when you play something like Yakuza. You see a vending machine and you think, yeah, Japan, especially if it has very weird drinks, like very weird sodas and so on and so forth. So this is what we would say that Japaneseness means as a shorthand for conversation. This is kind of a heuristics that something that we can use to understand each other when we discuss something, when we talk about Japaneseness. We identify the Japaneseness of something when we see cultural markers that we connect to Japan. And you've said vending machines, and that's very good because in our generation, I'm not that old, we know that Japan has a lot of vending machines, but maybe your parents, they know very little about Japan, they have not been there, and they think Japan, and they think raw fish, and again, the samurai, the emperor. So everybody is going to have a different idea, a different collection of markers to identify something. Since I love many German philosophers, when I think Germany, I think Schopenhauer. Some people will say Bratwurst, some people will say pretzel. I say Schopenhauer, okay? So everybody has a different set of ideas that they use to understand something. And we need this kind of signposts. We need to identify milestones on the road to read something. If you don't live in a country, You need this kind of helping hands, so to speak. So this is Japaneseness, very basically, very uncritically. I know I'm giving you the uncritical version, but then we can think that in Japan, these kind of markers operate as well. They don't use the same markers, but for example, when we talk about subcultures, they are very typical of a single space. They don't exist on a general level, and they are built around very specific markers. For example, here you have the Rekijo, the history fangirls, more or less translated, history fangirls who love Japanese history, who play a lot of otome video games, and who create their own fandoms and circulation structures and so on and so forth. Do you play otome games? Do you know what an otome game is? Some of you say yes. An otome game is a romantic dating game aimed at women, about romancing guys, and most of the times historical figures, okay? So when the Rekijo go to a castle, go to a Japanese castle, or learn Japanese history, they are articulating, they are putting in motion the ideas they have about this kind of romance and this kind of history. So if I play Nobunaga's Ambition, yeah, Susana Tosca is coming to talk about otome. Is fantastic, so don't miss that out. If I play Nobunaga's Ambition, which is not an otome, my point of view, the collection of markers I'm going to put in motion will be very different from the ones that are important to this girl here, okay? So maybe I will look for historical accuracy or something like that, and they look for how handsome Nobunaga is, or if they can romance Nobunaga, or something that they connect to the otome games they play, okay? So we use these central points as points of reference, these cultural markers. But this does not mean that these subcultures can only exist in the country of origin, okay? There are otome communities in Europe, in Italy, in Denmark, in Spain, maybe here in Germany, and they discuss otome games. They do so in their native languages or in English, and they value things about Japan through otome games. I love this slide. There's a lot of people that consider themselves to be experts in Japanese culture because they read a lot, because they played a lot. This is a very old post in NeoGAF. I'm very sorry for Mr. Muppet345. If he or she sees this video, my apologies. But I love this message. I don't know how much the rest of you know about Japanese culture. Brackets, I'm an expert, okay? When you get in touch with many cultural markers, you get this idea that you are an expert because your mental collection of cultural markers is huge. You say, hey, yeah, I can identify vending machines. I know what calorie mate is. I know what different plates of Japanese cuisines are. I can tell my ramen from my soba. I can tell Kyoto from Okinawa. I'm an expert. When you collect, like Pokemon, you collect cultural markers, your ideas about Japaneseness grow and grow and grow. The same way that if you come to Spain for a month or for a year, and you live, for example, in Mallorca, as I did, on your first week, you're going to go where everyone that comes from Germany go. And you go to the traditional places, and you look for Lonely Planet, and you visit these 3 or 4 main places. But after a year, you will come back here and say, I've been to Spain, and now I can say tapas, I can say cerveza playa, but I can say gracias, and I can say buenas noches. And you feel like an expert because you have a huge vocabulary and you can identify who makes the best horror movies in Spain, for example. So that's the way we use the ness of a culture: Japaneseness, Germanness, Europeanness. Okay, is that more or less clear until now? Okay, I'm not being too theoretical, am I? So bring it's a bit more complicated, because the Japanese are very good, very, very good, since they started using American games as their models. They did clones of American games. They are very good at making video games that have, inverted commas, no nationality, okay? They have what we can call the Mukokuseki game design. Mukokuseki means no nationality, okay? It's part of anime, it's part of manga, and if you think, for example, of Cowboy Bebop, a very important, a very seminal work in anime, the main protagonist is called Spike Spiegel, English plus German, and he fights like a fighter, a real figure from Hong Kong, and he dresses like a very stylish guy from France, maybe. He doesn't look Japanese at all, okay? It doesn't have the features that we identify as Japanese from the topic, the main cliches and the main topics that anime deals with. So Cowboy Bebop will be Mukokuseki. And many Japanese video games, they are Gêmu, they are made in Japan. Metal Gear Solid is made in Japan and it's very Japanese in its production, but the style is Mukokuseki game design, meaning that you have American protagonists, they are made in English, you have many mechanics and dynamics and ways of playing that are not exclusive to Japan, and these games are made with the whole world in mind, okay? So they might have Japaneseness markers, but you have to be very good at identifying how Japanese game makers think and what kind of things they do to realize that they are Japanese. For example, when you see Bayonetta, if you play a lot of action games from Japan, you are going to identify Bayonetta as an anime-inspired character action game with very flashy movements and so on and so forth. But there's nothing strictly Japanese in its fiction. Bayonetta is called Bayonetta or Cherise. She's not Japanese. The game doesn't take place in Japan. It takes place in a fictional country in Central or Eastern Europe. And the architecture there is inspired by Gaudí. So there are no Japanese markers, but there are markers of style, okay? You know that Cowboy Bebop is anime because you know about anime. But if someone doesn't know about anime and watches Cowboy Bebop, they can ask, where is this made? Where does it came from? Because I don't know. I cannot see any clear reference to the country of production. This will be like a separate level of cultural markers, okay? This is like the 1,000 extra points, experience points that Gerald promised here. This is where you get these points. When you identify cultural markers that have not to do with having Japanese characters or having, I don't know, scenes from Japan or the vending machine or whatever, but you think, yeah, I have noticed that Japanese video games tend to have special difficulty modes, or they tend to have finishing moves, or they tend to have this or that, okay? That will be a collection of markers that is Mukokuseki, but at the same time, to you as players, is very Japanese, okay? To get into this a bit more, I'm going to jump this. Pelletier-Gagnon explains that the idea of Japaneseness is a concept that is always in motion, that is constantly being re-articulated, that players and designers are playing with the ideas they have about Japan. And for example, nowadays, the house style of Dark Souls from Software has become very identified, very strongly connected to Japan. People think, yeah, Japanese game makers, they are doing things like Dark Souls, okay? But Dark Souls looks very German, with ruins and romanticism and a very specific type of painting, okay? So this is the connection of cultural markers that we re-articulate. when you know about Japanese video games and you play with them, you learn how you can identify a game even if it doesn't take place in Japan. Just to jump a bit, for example, this game is very Japanese, and I'm sure you will say, yeah, this is Japanese as hell, but it has Disney characters. It has characters that are very traditionally Western. So it's very transnational, but it's very Japanese in its style, okay? So to jump ahead, I skipped that, but we are finishing with the Japaneseness thing. Japaneseness will be akin to a cultural performance, okay? Well, I'm going to go back to this one. Andrew Dorman discusses Japanese films in an international context, and he says, when the Japanese film industry realized that they had success in other parts of the world, they had two options: to make movies that don't look Japanese in order to be accepted by everyone, or to make movies that do look very Japanese for the people that like Japanese movies because they are Japanese, okay? So you can have Cowboy Bebop, which doesn't look Japanese. I mean, at face value, stylistically, it's very Japanese, but it doesn't look Japanese, doesn't take place in Japan. Or you can have Drive My Car, the movie that won an Oscar before Will Smith slapped the other guy, Chris Rock, which takes place in Japan. It's very Japanese. It's based on a Haruki Murakami short story, and it's performing Japaneseness. And this does not mean that they are faking it, that the Japaneseness of one is better than the other, that hiding the cultural markers is better than exploiting them, or the other way around. It means that you have different strategies. Imagine, if you may, that all of a sudden German became the center of video game making of the world. Imagine this very happy situation. And then you could say, okay, so people like German games. This is basically what happens with board games. You are a powerhouse. You as a country are a powerhouse in board games. And you can say there are a set of ideas about style and gameplay and game types and genres in Germany that people like. And there's another group of people that like German games because they take place in Germany, okay? Because your game might be an urban fantasy or a low fantasy, but it takes place in Munich. You can go to Marienplatz, you can go to the cathedral, you can go anywhere in the country or in the city, and you can visit the city. This is what happens with Japanese cinema and Japaneseness in cinema. And it's very similar to what happens with Japaneseness in video games. So to jump a bit here, sorry. When we saw Ghost of Tsushima, have you played it? It's an American-made video game that takes place on a Japanese island based on fictionalizing Japanese history. And it even has a Kurosawa mode. Kurosawa is a very famous Japanese filmmaker. So when they added this, it was showing cultural markers of Japaneseness. Like, if you like Japan, if you like samurai, you probably like Kurosawa. So we are going to give you a Kurosawa mode, okay? But this game was not Japanese. They were articulating a collection of cultural ideas to attract players that love Japan. Even if the game was not Japanese, and the game is very Western, very American in its makeup, it's very Sony, so to speak. It's Infamous, Last of Us, Uncharted, plus Assassin's Creed, and so on and so forth. The setting and the story and the characters and the style from an artistic point of view is very, very, very Japanese. You have a gameplay mechanic. This is very tacky. This is very weird. But this because they know there's an audience that likes Japanese things and that likes to play in Japan, even if the game is not made in Japan. So to summarize, I have some extra ideas These are the two main points, Gêmu and Japaneseness. And I'm going to give you the short summary of the ideas. Gêmu means that we have to remember that video games are made locally, and they have benefits, advantages, and problems because of the country they are made in, like connection to another industry, like general culture of work or workplace environment or whatever. And this is Gêmu, okay? We have to analyze games made in Japan, remembering that they are made in Japan. And Japaneseness means that we have a collection of ideas about what we understand Japan to be and what we understand Japanese games to be that are played in motion, as Pelletier-Gagnon says, every time we play something made in Japan. Like, the new Zelda, Breath of the Wild 2, is Japanese, and now I see that they have something that looks like an Oni, and maybe this is because Japan, but they are at the same time imitating Skyrim, and they are filtering Skyrim through Japan, and we apply this all the time. Like, yeah, the Japanese work like this. For example, Breath of the Wild 2 has been delayed, and that's something that happens all the time, but Nintendo and other Japanese countries maybe manage it in a different way, I don't know. And there are cultural ideas, cultural aspects that we think are the way they are because they come from Japan. Okay, so Gêmu and Japaneseness. And you might say, okay, Victor, again, this is very abstract, this is very theoretical. How can I apply this to video games? Well, point one, the history of Japanese video games has given rise to different subgenres, and they have a historical development. They come out of very particular historical situations. Like, for example, even in a book like this, a book about games that never came out of Japan, Japanese video game obscurities, that is playing on this idea of Japan being the country of weird video games, of games that cannot be played elsewhere. If you look at the table of contents, you see role-playing games, strategy simulation games, adventure visual novel games. So they have like a shared collection of genres we all have, but within these genres, we see, for example, adventure and visual novel, okay? They have their own particular way of, let me jump this. So in summary, they have the main genres the same way we do, but the evolution of the genre, the particular evolution of the genre into subgenres is specific to Japan. For example, if you play visual novels, you have to know that visual novels were very Japanese until maybe 10 years ago, maybe less. They just came into the West through Steam and through independent games inspired by visual novels. But the visual novel subgenre was very, very typically Japanese until recently, okay? So it was a genre that evolved from adventure in Japan, and then we got it a few years ago. And now it has somehow been integrated into the kind of games we can do and we can sell in the West. Otome games, Susanna is going to come, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. Yeah, Famicom Detective Club just had a remake, and it was translated into English and published in the West. That was huge, historical. If you have told me 20 years ago that Famicom Metantei Kurabu was going to come out in the West, I would have said you were on drugs. So it's a very historical moment. And again, Susanna is going to tell you about visual novel and Otome, so I'm not going to jump into this. But the action games in Japan took the shape of the character action games like Bayonetta, Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, taking after anime and manga. They specialize in doing action games with very strong and very charismatic protagonists. And this is not exclusive to Japan, but the way they do it is a bit different. The mechanic of gacha that we have in games here and that we have become familiar with recently comes from Japanese, the Japanese context of toy collection, basically. horror video games were very influenced by Japanese game making, even when they took place in America, like Resident Evil, Biohazard, or Silent Hill. This is a very good text if you want to know more about what's Japanese about these Japanese horror games. I don't have time to explain it. Cooking as a mechanic is very central in Japanese video games. So there are many things that became popular in Japan that we are getting now, and that you can learn how to do it, how to do them, and why to do them, why they are appealing to players. And this is where, hey, Cooking Mama, yeah, I love it too. This is where I say that it's very good that you see the different variations of a genre and a style and a subgenre in different parts of the world, because you can see what makes the template important, what makes the template attractive. Many Japanese subgenres have become so strong as templates that they have their own game making tools. So RPG Maker is a game maker for basically Japanese RPG. And again, the history of Japanese RPG is very specific. We don't have time to get into it, but please know that it's an evolution. It's an off branch of computer RPGs. SRPG, simulation RPG, they're starting to become popular here, and they have their own creating tool. Visual novel maker, all of a sudden we have tools to make visual novels here in English, and we have a player base that is willing to play visual novels. And again, this was impossible to think a few years ago. So when you learn about how the Japanese Gêmu makers have articulated video games, and you see what they have done there, you can learn how to import it. Okay, you see these cultural markers, and they are there for the taking. It's not something that you are blocked from using. On the contrary, it's a creative tool that you can learn and you can exploit. So moving on, I will say that personally, and this is what I'm exploring at the moment, I'm about to publish a chapter on it. What I find very appealing about Japanese video games is that they have a strong sense of place. They use real life locations in a very, very clever manner. When you play a Japanese video game, you practice what Gerald calls virtual tourism. There's a lot of writing on virtual tourism, and even with the pandemic, the people like me that love Japan and we cannot go to Japan, I'm playing more Japanese video games now set in Japan, kind of to use them as a substitute drug to the actual thing of going to Japan. So Ghostwire Tokyo, I was about to mention it. Ghostwire Tokyo is very appealing for people that like this kind of game, and it's very appealing to people that like Tokyo a lot. And maybe there's an overlap there, and maybe some people that will never play a game like that are going to play it just because it takes place in a very detailed Tokyo, okay? So they use their places very, very well. Traditional emblematic landmarks, stereotypical locations like Meido Cafe, daily life places like schools, like supermarkets, and even nostalgic places, places that bring memories to mind, are very important in Japanese video games. Like here you can see people comparing Persona 5 Strikers and Ryoga Gotoku, Yakuza, in their depictions of Osaka. Furaiki, a series that is made to just show the countryside to the Japanese. This has never been released outside of Japan, but if you look for Furaiki, I would say that a Furaiki style game made in Europe could be a huge success, because it's basically touring the countryside and taking pictures and getting to know the locals. So if you did this in southern Germany, for example, I would play this a lot. You have many beautiful landscapes and you could exploit them the same way Furaiki does. I'm going to skip a few games, but for example, I love what Gagex is doing. They are doing games set in the 80s in Japan. Very small, basic games. They just released The Kids We Were on Steam and Switch. And even if I didn't grow up in Japan in the 80s, I play this and I get nostalgic about Japan in the 80s because the sense of place is very, very strong. They show typical neighborhoods, they show items, they show practices. You can go to a bathhouse, you can go to many places that were typical in Japan. And it's like, again, doing tourism. And you have even people like this poor guy here who go to Japan because they love Japanese video games. This is the story of a tourist from Martinica that went to Japan, to Tokyo, just because he was obsessed with Ryoga Gotoku, Yakuza, and he was looking for the spots of Ryoga Gotoku Yakuza in real life. I think there's money here. If you go to the municipality, if you go to the town hall and say, okay, I'm going to make a game based in Munich, and it's going to be very good for promotion, very good for showing people all over the world how beautiful Munich is and how appealing it is, maybe you could get some sweet money from tourism there. So that's just an idea. And some game that I would recommend. I love this game. I will tell you the name later because it's in Esperanto and have too many things in my mind. But it's a game that is based on the stories of a very popular writer of children's stories. And it's based on the collection of stories he wrote, Miyazawa. And I see this and I love Michael Ende. And I think, why are there not more games based on Michael Ende's work, on Momo and the Never-Ending Story, Jojo, whatever? If we love these books as European, why have not we made more books inspired by these traditional cultural markers? Rainy Season, a very short game that takes place all inside a traditional Japanese house on a day, on a rainy day, evidently, where the protagonist, a young kid, cannot get out and he has to fantasize within this house. Hidden My Game by Mom, by Hub Inc., smartphone games that are very comedic about daily life in Japan. I'm going to skip this. This is Gagex again. Reading games in Japan are still very popular, and they are slowly coming back to Nintendo Switch. Taiko no Tatsujin, we finally have Taiko no Tatsujin for Microsoft, Switch, PlayStation, and there are a lot of mechanics you can learn from reading games. And this is a collection of a catalog of weird controllers I want to finish on to remember and to remind you that Japanese video games have not cut their ties to the toy making industry. I'm not going to say anything, just look at these beautiful controllers, and they have a very toyetic way of thinking about how to play video games. And this is something that I miss most of the time here. They come up with new ways of interacting. Yeah, this was real. A sewing machine for the Game Boy. This is real as well. I have played this in Tokyo. You have to urinate here and fill a bar, and you get many rewards for doing so. And I just say that I don't like when people simplify Japanese video games because they are weird, and I know I'm doing it, but this is just a very small collection after I showed you many other things. Robot games, music games, fishing, action games. So, because we are reaching the hour now, my main takeaway is practical advice from the perspective of a scholar, a theorist that is researching, thinking about Japanese video games maybe too much and too often. I would say that always historicize, always look for the history of the kind of game that you want to make, of the kind of genre and mechanics you are trying to implement in your games. Be aware that you can exploit local markers. I'm sure there's a lot of things in Germanness that you can exploit without it being nationalistic or anything like that. Be good, be aware that you can connect with local talent. If you need animation, why not look for good animators in your country? Keep subcultures and niches in mind. Subcultures are very important. We think that video games have to be super transnational and they have to appeal to everyone. And cases like visual novels and otome show us that is the other way around. You have to find your niche and you have to find your very specific group of people that are going to love your games. You have to understand the global market. It's not contradictory. You have to keep in mind that you have a local market and a global market, and they coexist. The technical word here will be hyperculturality. We are all players, hybrid game makers. We are hypercultural. We are within one culture and connected, hyperlinked to many other cultures. Use places. I mean, I'm very tired of seeing the same fantasy landscapes in every video game I play. And for example, Assassin's Creed has been very good at looking for interesting locations and interesting moments in time. And it's not a Japanese franchise, but it's very good at doing that. Use subgenres, genres, and styles as templates. This means that look at visual novels and try to look at what makes visual novels appealing to people and use it as a creative starting point. Making an action game doesn't mean that you have to imitate the same action games that you have played, but you have to use action games as a creative starting point. And lastly, be playful. Remember that video games have deep connections to toys and the toy industry, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I hope this is practical enough. I'm going to give you my contact, and I'm going to thank you. My colleague Lorik is here. That's me. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to your questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Victor, for this very, very in-depth talk and so many things you were going into. And also very glad you showed many, many examples to our game design students, because I think many of them love Gêmu, Japanese games, gameness, and so on. So the questions are open. I would just ask you, Victor, because we cannot hear the students in the room. If there's a question in the room, maybe you could rephrase it before answering it. But yeah, we can also take questions online. You can raise your arm, ask a question, or put it in the chat.
Can you close your presentation? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Lots of applause in the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
So who wants to ask the first question? First question is always the most difficult to ask. Huh?
Do you have one, Gerald?
I've written down a couple of things here, but mostly out of interest. Well, I have one. You were talking about cultural performance in games. You said sense of space is very interesting. Maybe you could name some games from Japan, or could you name some games from Japan which are very good in cultural performance, but not only in space, also maybe in terms of mechanics? Which ones? I'm sure you mentioned a couple of them already, but just to name a few, maybe.
In terms of mechanics, like typical from Japan?
Maybe, yeah, mechanics that imitate Japanese lifestyle, Japanese culture, also a sense of spaces.
Yeah, the digital market, the eShop for Nintendo 3DS is going to close in a year's time. And if you have a 3DS at home, I will run and play Attack of the Friday Monsters, A Tokyo Tale. It's a game about a young boy growing up loving action superhero TV shows and just playing with his friends every evening and just walking about and running about and having fun. It's a very short and sweet game, and it's about exploring and having fun. And it's very nostalgic as well. So that will be a good introduction to how some Japanese game makers are dealing with daily life. But again, I will say Yakuza as well, because Yakuza is very good at being super melodramatic in one moment, and then the next moment it's about running an orphanage or going shopping or just I don't know, sleeping or whatever.
Thank you. Michael has a question. Let's go.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much for this great presentation, Victor. One question: this what do you personally think is this so huge hype in the last decades? If I remember in my history, if I was young, it was less so important. Every year, when I see my new students, they love this Japanese-ness and all the kind of pop culture in Japanese. So what do you think? What's the huge success in the Western part of the world?
So it cuts a bit. So you're asking why Japanese culture in general is so appealing?
Yeah.
Something like that? Well, that's a very good question and a very complicated question. And again, I would say that the roots of the matter are historical. And we had Japanism in Europe in the 19th century when Europe discovered Japan. Japan was close to the wall, and all of a sudden, the Americans forced Japan to open up to the world, and Europeans could go there. And they brought back drawings, and they brought back ukiyo-e, they brought back many things. And Japan was kind of idealized at that time. In fact, Oscar Wilde said that Japan couldn't be so perfect, and the Japan that people fell in love with must have been a pure invention, a fantasy land, so to speak. And nowadays, I think I just went to a seminar on East Asian culture and daily life and fans and so on. I think many people consume Japanese content, realizing that they are seeing a fantasy. So it's real life, but it's a fantasy at the same time. And they are very good at separating, for example, anime set in a high school from real high schools in Japan. So maybe that's your experience, where you watch anime or you read manga and you see, so to speak, Japan on screen, but you know it's kind of a fantasy escape, like a fantasy place. But I would recommend reading Matt Alt's book, Pure Invention. I'm going to write it in the chat because it's very good to see how popular culture from Japan invaded the world, and it's very long. It has to do with technology, it has to do with Japanism, it has to do with this kind of daily life fantasies, with slice of life as a genre, for example. Slice of life is a very important subgenre of anime and manga. Does it answer you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much.
And we have a question back there.
Yeah, yes, I would like to hear your thoughts about in manga. There's like, at least now, a style for manga, even though sometimes people who are drawing are not Japanese. There's like still a drawing style called manga, and about how we should call Japanese games
Gêmu.
And how would that work? Would that just be like actually for Japanese games, or like the style of Japanese games? Because there's like in anime, like nowadays there are like a lot of mangas or animes that are not from Japan, but
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. I'm going to rephrase it as well as I can. What she said is that we have manga and anime, but then we have manga made in Europe. For example, in Spain, we have magazines dedicated to Spanish manga, and people identify manga as a style. And for example, Netflix is producing animation shows made in America, made in Europe, and they say anime, like the anime for Castlevania. Castlevania is not an anime. The anime for The Witcher. The Witcher, the animation is not anime, but they use the label. They use the label as a style. So that's the question. If we use Gêmu, are we just referencing games made in Japan or games that imitate a certain Japanese style? I would say that that's a whole kind of worms, and that's a huge debate among anime and manga scholars at the moment. And I know people that are very strongly against calling manga something that's not made in Japan and calling anime an animation that's not made in Japan. But the main takeaway is that we can have this conversation because we have the word for it, like manga and anime. With Japanese video games, it's harder to have this conversation because we don't have the word. And I'm going to give you an example. In Japan, they didn't play Dungeons and Dragons. They didn't play tabletop role-playing games that much. And they got RPGs from computer RPGs, like Wizardry, like the early RPGs were the entry point for Japanese players into role-playing games. So when they made Dragon Quest and other JRPGs, they made variations of the computer RPG for Japan in a very stylistically Japanese manner. So they made RPGs without the RPG, let's say, base level, but JRPG became so popular that nowadays we have Western RPGs like Mass Effect and Dragon Age and so on and so forth, and JRPGs like Final Fantasy, like Dragon Quest, and they are played all over the world. And in the recent years, I have seen people from the West, using the genre JRPG to describe their games. I don't remember the name, but there was a game made in France, and they said, this is a French JRPG. No? And it's mind-blowing because you are saying this is a French-Japanese role-playing game. But they are using a word that refer to production as a style. And this is what I meant when I said that subgenres and genres are a template. Because we have anime, we can say Castlevania is an anime, and people are going to understand it. And maybe some people, as I do, are going to reject it and say, no, no, this is not anime because it's not made in Japan. But the meaning is we are imitating the most popular type of animation in Japan. No, that's more or less the conversation. They can say they are imitating something because they have the word for it. If we don't say this is a Gêmu and this is an American game, we are going to have these connections anyway, but it will be harder to discuss them. So I'm not against people here imitating Japanese games, but I would like to see a conversation a bit more fluent, a bit more fluid, a bit more refined in this regard. So I think maybe, I mean, we have Western visual novels, we have Western Japanese RPG games, and maybe we're going to have a Western version of Taiko no Tatsujin, probably. But we need to articulate this conversation because as designers, you need to have the vocabulary to describe what you are trying to do. This is what I'm trying to do, this is my inspiration, and this is my goal. So in any case, I think it will be good to use Gêmu as a category. But once you accept it, it's going to be a long debate because, again, in anime and manga, this is a huge fight they are having every day, and it doesn't have a clear solution. So I hope it helps. Welcome.
May I?
Yeah, please.
In the beginning, you were talking about cultural appropriation. Why is that such a concern, and why do you think it's not a problem?
I mean, well, the question is why is cultural appropriation such a concern, and why I don't think it's a problem. I mean, I do think it's a problem if you do it badly. But in the seminar I just went to on Monday, I don't remember the name of the author they show us, but there's we had like a typology of cultural exchanges, and you have some kind of exchanges that are on the same level, and normally in Japanese video games they are like that because Japanese video games are very strong, and they are even stronger than the other countries. So it's not really appropriation. You are not stealing, and most importantly, you are not erasing. My problem with appropriation is when you erase the creators. For example, if you come to Spain and you imitate Spanish music, I will say, yeah, we are all European and we can share styles, and it's perfectly nice. But if you do that and you deny the connections to Spanish music and you say that you have invented it and you kind of exclude people from the country from your club, that's when you get into trouble. And that's more common in cultures where people from many different backgrounds have to coexist. So that's more typically American than European. In Europe, I mean, we are diverse, but the history of Europe is very different, and we are dealing with problems now that New York had 200 years ago. So we are conversations. But there, you could see that people loved, I'm going to say something maybe a bit silly, but people loved Chinese cuisine, but they didn't have any Chinese friends. So that's when you get into trouble, when you say, yeah, I love these games, but I will never invite a Japanese game maker to my classroom, or these kind of things. That's when people complain about cultural appropriation, when you erase someone from the conversation. But another warning, that doesn't have to prevent us from learning from others. As I said in the beginning, cultures are made in connections. They become stronger and better in conversation. And I think it's good to have exchanges. And that's what I said. I'm going to talk about Japanese video games. I'm not Japanese. I think we can speak about Japanese video games, but I'm not representing Japanese video games. So that's what I try to do. I say, I'm European, I'm trying to learn from them. For example, for the conference series we had in Japan Foundation, we closed the whole program with an interview with Sueri, Hidetaka Suehiro, of Deadly Premonition fame, and we listened to Sueri. And we did not say, we are going to speak on behalf of Sueri, but we did analyze the work of Sueri. And the person who did it was Clara Fernandez Vara, a Spaniard living in New York. So I think any kind of exchange, if it's healthy, it's good. Because Japanese game makers started by cloning American games, and that was not a problem. So I hope this helps a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Super. Yeah, and someone asked about game design education in Japan. Gerald has already answered, DigiPen, and I will say that Ritsumei University is very good in general in research and in training, and they have this very important game center, so anything like that's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, you told, or you said that Japanese culture and history is highly romanticized here in Europe or in North America. So I was wondering, are there any historic or are historical games in Gêmu, are they common, and if so, are they as romanticized? Because here in Europe we have historical games about like medieval Europe, and some are quite realistic, but most of them aren't. And yeah, because most of the people are romanticizing medieval Europe, even if we live in this place. So I was wondering, is there the same thing, or aren't these historical games, are they even common?
That's a very good question about historical video games and the romanticization of the past within one's culture. I think that's very typical of any culture, because when you are within a culture and you look at history, you are biased. It's normal to be biased. You come from that culture and it's part of your makeup, it's part of your heritage. So you don't have a fully objective point of view. So when you play games made in Germany about German history, you're going to notice certain intentions, like the past was better, or this is what makes Germany German. You can see that, for example, in Great Britain with Brexit. They are going back to stories about the empire, to stories about the importance of the British Empire and to British identity. Whereas maybe in the 90s, they were a bit more European. So every time you discuss history, you do it from the present. And with Japanese historical games, these are particularly, I think, the kind of games that are made mostly for a Japanese audience, because you need to know the history in order to play them. Susanna is probably going to show you games about dating guys from the Shinsengumi, and the Shinsengumi were kind of a special police force that defended the old regime, the Bakumatsu, in the end of the closed country. The period where Japan was close to the world, and when people tried to bring back the emperor as a main political force in Japan, of course, some people were going to defend the old regime, and the Shinsengumi were seen as sort of the last samurai. So nowadays, even if you don't really agree politically with the idea of having a military dictatorship, the samurai are icons. They're icons of the country. And if you have the last samurai and you have someone outside of time, so to speak, they look romantic. So games about the Shinsengumi, they are not there to teach people in the West about Japanese history. They are there for people who already know what the Shinsengumi were, and people who maybe can tell history and fiction apart, and they just want to date romantic figures of the age of the samurai. So there's a lot of layers there where meaning can get lost if you don't know the history. And I think that's why many franchises that deal with history are very hard to export. But it will be the same with, I mean, mid-Europe is seen as a kind of universal reference, the same way the Roman Empire is seen as universal. But if we got a game from the, I don't know, 6th century India, it will be hard for us to understand it. We will need some kind of explanation, and maybe they will give us a separate book to read before playing the game. But yeah, in Japan, many historical games tend to be very romantic, and I think that's a worldwide phenomenon.
Do we have one more question? One or two more questions?
Yeah, you said earlier that in the beginning, Japan was replicating games from the West, and I don't know if you said it, but why did they do that, and why didn't they just have their own style and started with creating their own style and just replicating the other games?
Okay, the question is why did the Japanese started cloning American games? And it's purely historical and purely because of industry reasons. They didn't have a strong enough industry to create their own video games. And again, I'm going to simplify a lot, but you have to keep in mind that America, when Japan lost the war, World War II, America was there for 7 to 8 years, and in Okinawa it was there until the 70s. So they had military bases, and many companies like Taito were not meant for the Japanese. They were there to import jukeboxes and pinball machines and stuff like that to Japan. And they brought that for the Americans living in Japan. And when, again, I'm super simplifying this, but please bear with me. When the Americans said, yeah, I don't want to play this pinball anymore, then it moved to Japan, to the Japanese audiences as a kind of secondary market. So they got this, I don't want to say waste from American culture, but they got it secondhand. And when they started doing things, when you learn to do something, you imitate what is being done. Imagine that you have to do a superhero movie from Europe, from Germany. You will take Marvel and you will say, why do people love Marvel? Why is Marvel so successful? And you will start by replicating it. And again, you have to keep in mind that cloning is a very bad word. It's a loaded word, but imitation doesn't need to be loaded. Good imitation is necessary to learn. And you're a student, so you probably are making clones of video games you like, and you're making a Pong clone and a Pang and a Bubble Bobble, a Tetris clone or whatever, and that's the way you learn. So if Pong is like the biggest thing in the world at a given time, and you know how to operate machines, but you don't have the creative experience to create something new, you have two options. Try to do something like Pong, that's Pong, but for the Japanese, because Pong, I mean, Atari doesn't have the capacity to bring Pong to everyone in the world, or you can try to create something new and compete with Pong. I will personally go with the first. So I think it's very logical that they started by cloning, and then they have Nishikado and other people making games like Space Invaders, and only then they started going from Space Invaders to Pac-Man to Donkey Kong, bum, 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 one, another, and they had these heavy hits, innovating and leading. But I mean, for a long time, video games were just Japanese, and everybody imitated Japanese video games. So it's normal that when something is very successful, you look at the best model you have and you learn from there. And only then you start kind of specializing. I don't know if you see it as sad or, but it's.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Gerald, we have another one there.
At what point does something classify as Japanese? Because with cultures mixing, it can become hard to tell it apart. Because certain aspects are inspired by, for example, European culture.
At what point does something classify as Japanese? This was my point when I separated Gêmu from Japaneseness. Because some people will say, Yakuza is very Japanese, Bayonetta is very Japanese, Dark Souls is not, and Resident Evil is not. And I will say, they all are Japanese because they are Gêmu, and they articulate markers of Japaneseness in a different manner. If we only classify something as Japanese because it takes place in Japan and it's apparently Japanese, that's when you force a whole country and a whole culture to be in a given way. For example, I was talking about my go-to example here is Germany and Spain. And in Spain, we have a long tradition of horror movies with zombies. Jordi Jorge Grau made a very good zombie movie in England with England, with English producers and English money. But that's part of the heritage of Spain, cinematically speaking. We have many horror films that have paved the way for things like Rec. Have you seen Rec? It's very, very good. It's one of my favorite horror movies, not because it's Spanish, but because it's very intense. And if you love video games, you have to all watch Rec. It's too intense, maybe for some of you. For me, it is too intense, but it's a very good horror movie, sorry. So some people could say, Rec is not traditionally Spanish because it doesn't have anything like the Almodovar movies, or it doesn't have flamenco and paella and music. And I would say, no, it comes from a tradition of horror movies in Spain, and it's made by Spaniards, and it's kind of trying to do something within the country that comes from creativity from the country. So if Konami and the Silent team decided to do Silent Hill inspired by American, mainly American and also European writers, they are well within their right to do so. They are still Gêmu, and it will be idiotic to say, hey, you cannot touch America because you're Japanese. And they give their own spin. I mean, there are many things in Silent Hill that I think are the way they are because it was made in Japan. But it will be reductionistic to say, yeah, and this is because the Japanese mind and the Japanese culture. It's the historical moment. It's the idiosyncrasy of the country. So it's always a very complicated answer. And I'm sorry I cannot give you a more clear answer. But I think the answer will be something is from a country when it was made in that country. And in video games, we have a lot of co-productions, like a very international publisher that brings together a studio from Japan and another in France, and you do one part of a game, and you do another part of the game, and yada, yada, yada. But the country of origin is important, not because of an essence, but because it has a history and a set of conditions and a set of debates. Just to make it very short, the kind of debates they have in America at the moment have to do with post-Trump and maybe something else. The kind of influences, the kind of things you can see in movies made in India are going to be about Indian history. And they don't have to follow a model to be Indian, but they are made in India. So that's how I try to navigate these complicated things of acknowledging a country while not reducing a country to a very limited model. And if you like this, Gerald knows him, Thomas Majkowski has a project on national games and on what makes a game be from a certain nationality. And I think you have talk about this by him on the YouTube channel of Digra India. It's quite longish talk, but it's excellent. And it's a very, very hard question. So I'm glad you asked it, and I'm very sorry I cannot give you a better answer, but look for Thomas's video. Thomas Majkowski.
Basically, if a country is influencing certain content, then it's part of the country, or it's part of the way countries create games. For example, you mentioned the French JRPG. If I would take those aspects and create a new game, then would I have a French game or a Japanese or a Japanese game? Because I took the influence out of the French game, but took the influences from the Japanese game.
Exactly. You're asking about the specific case of the French JRPG. And I would say that when something like that happens, JRPG has stopped being something exclusively from Japan, and it has become a new kind of international genre. But there's a historical transition there. At some point, people decided that JRPG was not Japanese RPG, but it was just JRPG. It was a kind of game. And to me, that's fascinating because you see the pieces in motion. You have Japanese RPGs, and it has to feature Toriyama drawings, and it has to follow very limited tropes. And then you say, no, my game is a JRPG. And I will argue that the South Park role-playing games are JRPGs at heart because they are basically like Paper Mario. And Paper Mario is very JRPG-like, so and it's Japanese. So I think there's a transition there. The same way that survival horror began with Alone in the Dark in France, and then it went to Japan, and Japan was a dominating force for many years. And then we started seeing survival horror games in Europe and America and so on and so forth. Imagine that at the time they had said, this is not a survival horror game, this is a Japanese horror game. Then you see something like, I don't know, whatever that's inspired by Resident Evil, and you will have to say, no, this is an American Japanese horror game. But these kind of exchanges are very thought-provoking for me. They're very exciting because you see that something from one country becomes international, and then we all learn this new language, and then we use this as a general thing. And it's, again, if this happens in a respectful manner, I'm very happy with that, with this exchange. So.
I think there were a couple of questions in the chat, and then we could maybe wrap up.
Super. I'm going to read them aloud and to try to answer. Yeah, Julian says that the best comparison for that will be the Ringu. And I will say that Zero, Project Zero of Fatal Frame came out, it was created because horror games in Japan did not connect to the J-horror that was being made in cinema. So they were trying, the original team tried to make a J-horror survival horror game. Even if Resident Evil and Silent Hill were Japanese, They tried to do a J-horror game with Project Zero, and I think they succeeded, because I think that's a fantastic franchise. Michelle says that, was that Japanese Pong different in visualization than the Western one? No, they, I mean, the graphical, the visual capacities they had were very limited, and Pong and Ele Pong and many other games at the time, they all looked basically the same. So I would say that the first game that took cues from Japanese visual culture will be Space Invaders, because the design of the creatures is very manga-like, and they were drawn on paper before they were implemented as pixels. So you see visual thinking in there, and to me that's very, very Japanese. But before that, it was very hard to express something with graphics, with images. And the last question I think will be, is it okay then to say that it has to be taken in mind before playing a game from a certain strong cultural country like Japan to know a bit more about the historical values from that country? I mean, it's good. It's good if you want to analyze the game. But if you want to play Dark Souls or Elden Ring, I don't think you need to think about Japan before playing Dark Souls. Because again, I think Dark Souls has a very strong fascination with European ruins, something that you don't have in America, something that you don't have in Japan. You can find some ruins, but it's very, in Okinawa probably, but it's very hard. So I would say that you can enjoy the game on a first level without thinking about the culture of origin. But in this room, we are not only players. We are players, I'm a scholar, and you are developers, designers. And we all have something in common. We analyze and analyze and analyze and overthink and overdescribe, and we use many words, and we go all over one thing and again and again and again, and we try to exhaust something, even if we are not playing it. I don't know if I'm making my case here, but for a designer, I think that's very good. If you learn about the country, but again, don't simplify it. I wouldn't say that Tetris is a typically Russian game, for example. I would say that it's connected to the Pentaminos, and I would say that it's a very creative puzzle, but it was created from a combination of action, of sports, tennis, with the Pentaminos puzzle. So it doesn't have any really Russian traits to it. And the music and the backgrounds, the Russian references in Tetris were added in 1987 when Tetris reached the West to sell it as a very Russian video game. So again, we can say Tetris is Russian, and the history of Tetris, especially how the rights to Tetris were sold, has a lot to do with the way the Soviet Union operated. But the making of Tetris, I mean, the game design of Tetris is not, it does not demand a huge knowledge of Russian culture, so to speak. So you have to be flexible with that. And it's always good to be cultured. It's always good to know about things. So there's always going to be uses for that. So Gerald, would you say that that's it?
Nicholas asked if I played Elden Ring, but I didn't have time to.
Me neither.
Victor, thank you so much for this very almost 2-hour talk. And I think the next semester I'll let you teach the game culture course, because you're doing a great job. Yeah, thank you so much for everybody who was online, who was in the hall. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but maybe next time. Thank you, Victor. Big round of applause for him.
Thank you.
For everybody else, I'm going to see you tomorrow morning at the storytelling lecture. If that's the case, y Víctor, espero verte pronto, ¿vale?
A ver, luego hablamos. Cuídate.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.